only. The purpose here today is to give you all a good, solid understanding of the changes that were made during the last legislative session to 7.1 and an idea of how those things will be implemented or how we'll administer them going forward to the extent that those things have been decided. Obviously, some of those decisions and discussions are ongoing, so we may not have every answer here today, but you will walk away with a good understanding of what the changes to 7.1 were during the 2024 session. I also want to note there you can see we do use some images, and all of those images are used under the fair use educational exception to the Copyright Act. So here our first substantive slide is an outline, a table of all of the impacted statutory sections. Also identify some of those as new. So each bill has a corresponding list of impacted statutes. Some of the slides that you'll see in this presentation do include the impacted statutory section, but most of them do not, and we just didn't want to crowd the screen. So if you can refer back to this table if you want to see which sections were impacted by which bill. So we're going to go ahead and start with the House Enrolled Acts, and we'll do them in numerical order. And we're starting with House Enrolled Act 1025. This was the known as the mixed beverage bill. And it's important to note that this bill, along with all of the other bills, are effective July 1 of 2024. There are some compliance deadlines that vary based on the compliance requirements and logistical needs of implementation. And we'll get to that later in the presentation when it's relevant. But as a general matter, all of these bills are going to be effective, all these changes effective July 1. So HE 1025, fundamentally, it defined a new category of product, mixed beverage, and it incorporated the distribution sale of mixed beverages into the wine wholesaler scope of permit. Also repealed the prohibition on the sale of more than 1 million gallons of flavored malt beverage in a calendar year by a wine wholesaler permit holder that also has a liquor wholesale permit, excuse me. And the new definition of mixed beverage is a prepared cordial, cocktail, or highball that is in a can or container that holds not more than 24 ounces and is a mixture of whiskey, neutral spirits, brandy, gin, or another distilled spirit, and carbonated or plain water, pure juice from a flower or plant that is other flavoring materials, excuse me, and that it's suitable for immediate consumption. It contains at least 0.5% alcohol by volume, but not more than 15% alcohol by volume. And there are some examples down here. The high noon drinks would qualify as a mixed beverage under this new statute. And I'm going to hand it off to Ashley to give a little context with regard to this bill and the impact.
Yeah, so we've already received some questions, even though we're still, a little ways away from that July 1 date. But one of the questions that we received was whether micro wine wholesalers will be permitted to sell the mixed beverages. And the answer to that question is yes, mainly just because micro wine wholesaler is a term of art, if you will, and the only difference between a micro wine wholesaler and a standard wine wholesaler is the amount that's being sold. So those micro wine wholesalers are limited to 12,000 gallons of wine in a year. And if they meet that, threshold, then they just essentially pay a lower permit fee, but they have the same scope of permit and the same privileges as regular wine wholesalers. And kind of going along with that, we received a question asking whether flavored malt beverages and mixed beverages will count towards the 12,000 gallon cap for micro wine wholesalers. The answer to that question is no. Just because, by definition, flavored malt beverages and mixed beverages are not considered wine. Wine has its own definition. So the 12,000 gallon cap only applies to wine and brandy. So the answer to that question is no. Okay, so going along with that, we kind of wanted to give a breakdown of what wholesalers are able to do prior to July 1 and what they cannot do. So prior to July 1, that effective date, wholesalers cannot stage the mixed beverage products in their warehouse. That is mainly because the inventory can't even arrive at their warehouse until July 1. So uh, Similarly, they can't make sales to retailer or dealer permittees. If it's not in their inventory, they can't make that sale. And because they can't be at the warehouse until July 1, you obviously can't make that sale if it's not already part of your inventory. So also, you can't allow salesmen to engage in any activities related to the mixed beverages. Again, just because those sales cannot occur until the effective date of July 1, when the wholesalers will be permitted to have those mixed beverages in their warehouse and make those sales. However, with all that being said, prior to July 1st, wholesalers are able to enter into contracts with primary sources of supply manufacturers to distribute these mixed beverages as long as the contract term has a start date of July 1st or later. Again, that just goes back to the fact that they cannot purchase, sell, import, transport, possess those mixed beverages until July 1. So you can get, your contracting out of the way. But pretty much everything else is going to be left until after July 1st.
Great, thank you, Ashley.
And then just a couple reminders. This bill is not going to impact which retailer permittees and dealer permittees can carry or sell or buy the mixed beverages or ready-to-drink cocktails, as they're commonly referred to. You would still be required to hold a permit, which you can furnish liquor. So the wholesalers can only sell, transport, or deliver those mixed beverages to a liquor retailer, a supplemental caterer, a liquor dealer, a liquor wholesaler, and another wine wholesaler. So just keep that in mind.
Thank you very much, Ashley. That was helpful context. And moving on just to a summary of the impact of HEA 1025, the mixed beverage bill. It creates a new category of mixed beverage, which is defined in the statute. And it's important to note that a mixed beverage is not wine under the statute, but its own product. It expands the scope of the wine wholesaler permit to include the purchase, import, and sale of mixed beverages and the sale of flavored malt beverage to employees. And it eliminates the restriction on the volume of malt beverages distributed by the holder of both a wine and liquor wholesale permit that was previously limited to 1 million gallons. So moving on to our next bill, HEA 1086. This was just phrased alcoholic beverage sales. It has three pretty big and wide-ranging changes to the permitting regime under 7.1. It adds a responsible happy hour, social hour privilege allowance for retail permit holders. It adds, or I shouldn't say it adds, but it modifies the carryout sales regime in the existing code. It introduces the concept of a qualified container. And then the third and other broad change is the addition of liquor liability insurance requirement. Liquor liability insurance is also known as dram shop insurance, and HEA 1086 introduced a requirement that all retail and craft manufacturers must have dram shop insurance in order to qualify for their permit. Beginning with responsible happy hour, social hour, the bill HEA 1086 introduced a happy hour privilege for retail permit holders. That happy hour privilege is limited to a maximum of 4 hours per day and 15 hours aggregate in a given week, and it is prohibited between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m. So that is the general allowance for happy social hour, and it's constrained by those conditions. In addition to, or I guess complementary to the addition of the happy hour privilege, there were a couple of new prohibitions introduced on retail permit holders by this bill, and those included limitations on bar games that can be sponsored and held inside of the licensed premise. Specifically, you cannot have a bar game that's based on the winner is based on the quantity of alcoholic beverages consumed by a patron, or that awards an alcoholic beverage as a prize. Obviously, this does not apply to charity gaming situations where you have an allowable event being performed by a qualified organization. And there is still the remaining prohibition on selling or serving an unlimited or indefinite amount of alcoholic beverages for a fixed price. Now, this doesn't impact group alcohol sales for like a wedding package. That's still permitted, but the intent here is to prohibit unlimited amount of alcohol sold to individual persons. Like a bottomless drink special, that would be prohibited under the responsible social hour, happy hour provision. And the happy hour privilege, social hour privilege, it can be revoked for any violation of the requirements imposed thereon. And it's important to note along these lines that the expectation is permit holders will have policies and internal controls to ensure that their happy and social hour is performed in a way that's responsible, and that the safety of both the public and patrons is always maintained by those policies. And as we'll discuss here in a bit, the dram shop requirement is also going to introduce this internal control concept to the permitting regime, as internal controls, the strength and effective nature of those controls is going to be a factor in the rate for dram shop insurance for most insurance providers, if not all. In terms of the carryout changes that are introduced by HEA 1086, it essentially expands the existing carryout privileges for retail permit holders. It includes mixed drinks and cocktails to go, and those drinks or any other drinks that are delivered under this provision must be delivered directly to the customer on the licensed premises in a qualified container for consumption off the licensed premises. And the individual retail permit holder must have currently have carryout privileges or obtain carryout privileges in their next renewal or upon the new application. It is not an automatic right that is conferred by the bill. It is something that is a privilege that must be applied for, just as the existing carryout privileges are. And the key bit here, I think, that we need to discuss is this concept of a qualified container. And I've provided the word by word language that's in the new law, but I'll read it to you here so I can emphasize what's probably most important in terms of us distinguishing between a qualified and non-qualified container. A qualified container is a new, clean, sealable container that is for the sale of alcoholic beverages for consumption off the premises, that A, has a liquid capacity of not more than 4 quarts, and B, is sealed with a device or material that is used to fully close off the container securely without any perforations or straw holes. And it's important to note that the failure to use a qualified container may result in the loss of carryout privileges. Similar to the responsible social and happy hour, if you fail to follow the requirements, that privilege can be revoked as its own sort of stick within the bundle of privileges in the scope of permit. In terms of what we're looking at and which terms are most important to keep in mind as you go out and procure qualified containers, we are looking at this is a new, clean, and sealable container, and it is actually manufactured and sold for the sale of alcoholic beverages for carryout. So below you'll see this is a Applebee's party bag. It has a sealable cap that has sort of like a milk carton thing here that would show you if it had been opened. It'll pop and it'll indicate that it's been opened. And then these tamper evident stickers would be wrapped around the top of the container to indicate that it had been opened after it's been opened. Over on the right here, we have Jello shots inside of a Solo cup with a cap on it. That's obviously not a container that was made for the sale of carryout alcoholic beverages. That is not securely sealed and closed, and there is no tamper evident indicator on those containers.
Chris, I'm going to go ahead and interrupt you here.
Yes.
I know we're still trying to get the CLE form emailed out, but for those that are participating in this for CLE credits, I wanted to give you the first code word to jot down. And that is, surprise, surprise, qualified container. And I will go ahead and put that in the chat.
All right. Thank you very much, Ashley. So then moving on to the next requirement within HEA 1086, or the next change, I should say, and this is a requirement. It is the introduction of the liquor liability insurance requirement, and effective July 1, and I'll go over the compliance deadlines on the next slide, but say in summary, it's effective July 1, all retail manufacturers and craft manufacturers, retail permit holders and craft manufacturers have to have a minimum of $500,000 in liquor liability insurance in order to qualify for the permit. And this this portion of the bill also added a definition of the term craft manufacturer, which is a term of art that's utilized in several places in 7.1 and didn't previously have a definition. In terms of the compliance deadlines for the dram shop requirement, as a general rule, any application that is submitted after June 30th of 2024 must include evidence of insurance with the application. Any application that is submitted before July 1, you must provide evidence supplementary to that application before January 1st of 2025 that insurance has been obtained. So if you were to apply today and obtain your permit, you don't have to provide proof of insurance at this time. However, between now and January 1 of 2025, you have to provide proof that you have complied and obtained dram shop insurance that's consistent with the requirements. And we will be coming up with a mechanism for that supplemental information to be submitted, and we'll be in communication once that has been created. In terms of extensions, if you apply for an extension after July 1 of 2024, then you must either provide proof of insurance or evidence that you have begun an application for dram shop insurance. The idea being here, of course, that an extension is an existing permit. So we aren't necessarily requiring that you meet the insurance requirements at the time you provide the extension, but you must at least demonstrate that you have begun the process and are actively in the application and review process for dram shop insurance. And again, that would apply to any extension of a retail permit submitted after July 1 of 2024. In terms of evidence of coverage, and this will all obviously be incorporated into our retail permit application, but evidence of coverage is going to be a copy of the policy declarations page and liquor liability endorsement from your individual policy. And as a general rule, the application is going to require that you provide the coverage amount, the name and address of the insured premises, and the term of coverage. If you are unsure of how to obtain liquor liability insurance, if you don't currently have it, then you can contact either your local independent insurance agent or your existing insurance agent, and that individual will be able to help you find companies that are offering liquor liability insurance and hopefully find you the best rate so that you can obtain the insurance without much of a headache. If you are unfamiliar with your local independent agent, you can go to the Professional Insurance Agents website. It's PIA.org, or the Independent Insurance Agents of Indiana. They're known as Big I, and that's www.bigi.org. And it's important to note that liquor liability insurance is typically on a standalone policy, but it's part of a bundle of your insurance policy. So it should be able to be incorporated into your existing bundle. And we were told, based on a conversation with a very good and very helpful insurance agent that does a lot of liquor liability in Indiana, that typical premiums are going to range from about $300 to $5,000 a year, depending on risk factors. So really, it's in your control as a permit holder to determine what your coverage is going to look like in terms of cost. And I will discuss that in a little more detail here on this next slide. What the insurers are looking for, again, based on our conversation with this agent, and this is probably going to vary like all things by insurance provider. But as a general rule, it's safe to say that the adequacy of internal controls related to the service of alcohol and how you deal with intoxicated customers, it's going to be an important factor in what the insurance agent is looking at in terms of determining what your rate is and what your eligibility is for Dram Shop insurance. So if you don't currently have internal controls, that's something that you're definitely going to want to put in writing and implement here before you begin your application for insurance. In terms of your servers and bartenders, ensuring obviously that they have their proper training provided by the ATC. And then if there's additional training that you think would be helpful, that would be encouraged as well. I think that would help you with your rate. The insurance providers are also looking at food and alcohol sales ratios. So how much food versus how much alcohol are you selling, and the premises square footage. The agent that we spoke to said that sometimes this is an either or. Some agents or some insurers are going to look at and put the focus on the square footage of the premises, while others are going to put the focuses on food and alcohol sales ratios. Another factor, hours of operation, time of last call. If you're a bar that's serving until 3 a.m., you may have a different rate than an establishment that's serving until midnight. They're also going to look at the ATC violation history, police runs and incidents, and that includes, of course, DUIs. And another one, assaults. Something that I didn't think of off the top of my head that they might look at was the existence of the history of assaults and batteries that occur on the premises. And along these lines, recreational activities on site may be a factor for premiums. That's a may, and I think really it depends on the rest of the context. So with recreational activities, the idea is that you may, foster a competitive environment, and when you add alcohol, it may result in fights. So if there is recreational activities coupled with a history of violence on site, that would obviously be a factor in determining your rate. And then how do you deal with happy hour and drink specials? What are the policies and the procedures in dealing with that? And as I said back when we were introducing the responsible happy hour privilege, these internal controls and your policies and procedures, they're not only important for you complying with the happy hour privilege requirements, but also in terms of determining your rate for insurance. Lastly, and again, this is not an exhaustive list. Every insurance provider is going to look at different factors, and they may look at half of these, all of these, 10 more of these. That's really up to the individual insurance provider. But just looking at your menu and your beverage prices is going to be another factor.
Chris, I'm going to interrupt you here again
Yes.
for our second code word. Again, we're still trying to get that CLE form out, but want to make sure you have the code words. The second code word is going to be Dram Shop, and I will go ahead and drop that in the chat as well.
All right. Okay, let's see. Yes, we are moving on then to House Enrolled Act 1197, and this was the ATC agency bill, as we will introduce in the following slides. Some provisions of the bill were added by the legislature through the input of stakeholders, weren't necessarily things that the ATC had suggested, but they were things that we obviously did not oppose. So beginning then with the changes that the ATC had introduced, essentially we were looking for a modernization bill, a bill that would modernize communication requirements so that the ATC could communicate with permit holders, stakeholders, and representatives in electronic format rather than having written requirements, mail requirements. So we went through, and every instance where it says that the ATC must communicate with the permit holder, we added an alternative electronic communication option that can be utilized by the ATC. We added an allowance for an online electronic application to be facilitated by and utilized by the ATC. So instead of it just being in writing on a paper form, it may also be electronic. As you all are aware, most of our permits are currently online as well as paper. We removed the requirement that the Form 1, the property tax clearance form, that it must contain an embossed seal of the county treasurer. We removed that requirement. So those documents are no longer going to require the embossed seal of the county treasurer. And there was one section of Indiana code that still referred to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, simply removed that reference and replaced it with Alcohol and Tobacco Tax and Trade Bureau, who is our federal parent agency, I suppose you could say, or their successor agency, seeing as that could change. We also looked through and identified provisions of 7.1 that were outdated, that were either moot or that were replaced by other statute. And that included the beer garden and patio rooftop bars of civic centers and recreational facilities. That was replaced by the general allowance within, the confines of the statute of outdoor bars. So that was no longer relevant or necessary special caveats to that general prohibition, seeing as that prohibition no longer is in place. And based on a decision of the United States Supreme Court, the Tennessee Wine and Spirits Retailers Association versus Thomas, we did repeal the beer wholesaler residency requirement, which it was determined to be unconstitutional by that court. I know there was some other state litigation that dealt specifically with beer wholesaler residency, but that Supreme Court case generally prohibited the residency requirement for the permit. So the changes HEA 1197 introduced with regard to specific permits. No brand new permit was created in this session. However, there were some expansions, some revisions to the qualifications for some of our existing permits. For example, the Civic Center. We added that a park or public recreation area with a permanent event or entertainment space that is leased or owned by a county, city, town, or township. That's one of the qualifying locations for a civic center permit. And that was based on some input we received from some of our local partners regarding facilities that they had on their public land in their parks that were not being able to be utilized to their full potential due to there not being an allowance for a civic center permit in that context. So that new park with a permanent entertainment space qualification was added to the civic center permit. The food hall master permit, there was an economic development addition to the qualifications. So now historic site, technology park, or a food hall that has at least 10 distinct non-affiliated vendors and is located in an economic development project with a total investment from all sources of at least $100 million may now apply for a food hall master permit. We updated the craft manufacturer hospitality permit, which is a niche permit. It's not used a whole lot, but there was a request from the industry that was reasonable for craft manufacturers to be eligible to host those events on their licensed premises. So that change was introduced and adopted as well. And then in terms of non-quota economic development permits, the city of Noblesville was granted 14 new permits. 4 are under the general economic development permit at the beginning of the code that has the code section, that lists the individual cities and towns that are eligible for this specific permit type. Those 4 are there. And then under subsection G, a new subsection G was created that allocated 10 additional economic development permits to the city of Noblesville that are going to be issued 3 in 2024, 3 in 2025, and 4 in 2026. If they're not obtained in the assigned year, then those permits, they'll disappear. So those 10 will be theoretically issued in that order. And then the town of Delphi was granted 2 new economic development permits under new subsection H. Hotels. So the smoking allowance in outdoor bars for hotels was reinforced. And now smoking is allowed, or smoking is still allowed in an outdoor bar area, assuming it's 21 plus, is surrounded by an 18-inch barrier, and it's at least 20 foot from entrances. It's not really a change. It's just an additional codification of an existing allowance. And then there was also the codification of what's contained currently only in IAC, allowing outdoor bars in a hotel. So currently that is allowed, but it's only allowed in regulation, in administrative code. It is now statutory, it's codified. And then the DORAs, the designated outdoor refreshment areas, the craft manufacturers were added to eligible designated permittees. The intention, I believe, from the beginning with the DORAs was to include craft manufacturers. The statute's now been updated to codify that reality. So now going forward, designated permittees will include and do include retailer and craft manufacturers. Again, everything's effective July 1, so just keep that in mind here. SEA 20. So we are now on to our Senate enrolled acts. This was essentially a technical correction to the municipal riverfront district permits. And if anybody's not familiar, essentially the statute provides that a permit, a three-way restaurant permit, can be obtained within a municipal riverfront development project that's funded by state and municipal funds. As the statute is currently, and before the introduction of SEA 20, that funding requirement stated state and city money. And if you're familiar with the definition of a municipality under Indiana code, it means city or town. So the intention of the code was to allow for riverfront districts and cities and towns to participate in this permit. However, it unintentionally, I suppose, excluded towns by virtue of having a city funding source requirement. So now the statute states what it always was intended to, that you are eligible for this if you're funded by a city and town and the premise is located within a riverfront development district. SEA 58. This is a rather narrow addition to Indiana code, and the general intent and scope of this bill just creates a narrow exception to the gross retail income requirement for carryout sales for a specialty or gourmet market. And this is a new concept, a new establishment as defined by Indiana code. And a specialty or gourmet market it sells specialty foods for consumption on or off premises, including deli meat, fruits and vegetables, gourmet cheese, pasta and noodles, herbs and spices, and olive oil and specialty wine. Holds a beer and wine retail permit and does not sell automotive fuel. So that is what a specialty or gourmet market is. However, for the purposes of the exception to the gross carryout sales or the gross sales requirement for the carryout privilege, that only applies to a specialty or gourmet market that was initially issued the retail permit and carryout privileges in November of 2019. So for the purposes of this section of the code, the exception, it survives, that requirement survives transfer. So even as long as the retail permit and carryout privileges were initially issued in November of 2019, they're not going to lose the exception by virtue of a transfer. So that exception would survive the transfer. Hopefully that's clear. Again, it's a very narrow change to Indiana law, so it's not going to have a big impact on everybody here pretty much. SEA 146. This was not necessarily an alcoholic beverage law. However, it did impact 7.1 and it did impact alcoholic beverages in a narrow sense. So this bill introduced the allowance for a person who is at least 18 years of age to sell alcoholic beverages in the course of the person's employment. It allows a waitress, waiter, or server who's at least 18 years of age to serve alcoholic beverages in a dining room of a restaurant or hotel under the conditions of the Youth Employment Code. It does not impact it does not allow restricted employees to act as a bartender or to serve in a bar area. You still must be 21 years of age for that, and it has no impact on volunteer permits. There is no restricted volunteer permit. The volunteer permit is 21 plus, and that remains the fact. So in sum, on SEA 146, this bill allowed and will allow effective July 1, a person who is 18, 19, or 20 to obtain a restricted employee permit. So the only change was to revise and expand the restricted employee permit to 18-year-olds. Okay, SCA 205, collaborative brewing or contract brewing. I think both of those terms are apt. And this is a bill that allows small breweries that produce no more than 90,000 barrels, which is the definition of a small brewery, per year to manufacture beer for another small brewery under certain requirements. Those requirements specifically are, upon completion, the beer that's brewed is transported back to the permit holder for whom it was manufactured. And the contract, the brewery who is completing the brewing, the manufacturing in this instance, has to have produced at least 40 barrels of their own product from raw materials at that licensed premises in the previous year in order to qualify for the contract brewing allowance. The number of barrels produced under contract cannot exceed the number of barrels produced from raw materials of the brewery's own product at that licensed premise in the same year. And generally, all records regarding contract and self-brewed from raw materials barrels of beer has to be maintained and produced to the ATC upon request. And so, as you can see in the picture, those two guys, they're working together on a product. So it's either a contract brewing where you're saying, hey, can you brew this beer for me that I created? Or it's two breweries getting together and coming up with a joint product that they're going to brew as a collaborative effort. And that's a SCA 205. And I believe that is the end of our very fast recitation of the bills for alcoholic beverages in 2024. It's important to note that we will have another webinar / CLE in May, on May 17th, 2024, featuring guest appearance, speaking of collaboration, of the Indiana Department of Revenue. And we're going to talk about the tobacco bill, SCA 146, and then we're going, or 149, excuse me. And then we're going to talk about HEA 1120 and SCA 146 regarding taxes. So that is, I think that is actually a typo. It's not SCA 146. SCA 146 is youth employment, but this webinar will be about taxes and tobacco. That's the bottom line there. Okay, and here's our contact information. So you can get a hold of Ashley and I. Always say this, email is the best way to get a hold of us. We're always on the run in meetings. So if you shoot us an email, we can always call you if that's necessary, or correspond in writing and get your questions answered that way. And don't forget, if you are an attorney, submit your CLE attendance form to atcrules@atc.in.gov by Tuesday, April 30th. And those secret words that have already been provided should be stated there on that form. So, Jessica, do we have questions?
Well, first I would say Ashley did provide a link to our website for the CLE form. I can chat here again in just a minute, so kind of CLE form there. The question we don't answer yet. Let's see.
Jessica has been having issues with her teams for a while, and you're all choppy, Jessica. I'm so sorry. I'm not sure if anybody heard you.
I think she was trying to say that we got the CLE attendance form up on our website. I also dropped a link to that on our website in the chat.
Okay, so
but with that being said, if there are more questions, go ahead and drop them in the chat and we can address them as they come up. We still have a little bit of time here, so we want to make sure we get to everyone's questions.
Yeah, and I
you
will
guys,
note.
can you hear me better now?
Yes. Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, so I've answered some questions as we've gone along. I think one question we haven't gotten to is there a point of contact for approving qualified containers? You can email any of us to discuss a qualified container. The items you'll need to demonstrate are one, that it is intended for the sale of carry-out alcohol. If it is a general cup for the sale of to-go beverages like a soda, that will not be approved. If it's anything using one of those containers and tape or something like that, that's not intended for the sale of alcoholic beverages, and it has to be sealable. So those are the keys there. So the goal is that it cannot be something that somebody's going to get in the driver's seat of a car and can easily access. So you're looking to protect yourself in that, have that sealable container. So if somebody gets pulled over, it's readily obvious that they opened it, not you sold it to them, in an open fashion. But you can email any of us with questions on specific containers. Let me see what else is still out there for questions. Are craft manufacturers allowed to have an 18-year-old server?
If it's not inside the bar area, then there would all of the same restricted employee permit requirements apply. So the only change is that if the restricted employee permit is not currently applicable to the craft manufacturer, this bill would not allow it to an 18-year-old to serve. Only those circumstances where a restricted employee can serve would an 18-year-old be included or expanded to. I think does that answer, I think, the question?
Yes.
Yeah, it really depends on the facts on the ground.
And then we had a question about a social club without carry-out privileges. Would a permit without current carry-out privileges need to apply for them to get the carry-out?
Yes. And all of the same qualifications for carry-out privileges are in effect.
So this goes back to actually last year's legislative, but
All right.
can an RC permit be used in a DORA? So a club, yes, we've approved that.
There's one about the happy hour special have to be available at all service points within a licensed premises, e.g. an outside patio bar, an inside dining room bar within the same premises. That's not a requirement. The general rule is that you have internal controls that are adequate to ensure responsible and safe service. So it's really up to the individual permit holder how that issue is handled and where the happy hour is effective. Jessica, you can correct me if I'm wrong on that.
No, I think that's okay. Can wineries or distilleries take part in collaborative brewing? That was specific to breweries, correct?
Yep. You got to be a
Correct.
brewer. You got to make 90,000 or less barrels of beer a year. So.
Will small brewer permit holders still be able to refill growlers after July 1st? Yes, that privilege was not removed. The clean container is a separate requirement, and the clean new container would apply to anyone who is not a manufacturer.
And then Clark asked about a temporary permit, happy hour on a temporary. No, it's retail permits only. So it's sort of like carry out. I think it's the same concept there. Happy hour is not, you can't do it with a temp.
And we answered this in the chat, but we had a lot of questions about whether dealer permits could participate in happy hour. And the answer is no, this was specific to retail and craft manufacturer. We also had questions about whether a beer and wine dealer permit could sell ready to drink cocktails or those mixed beverages. No, this is still a liquor product. So it would still be limited to only a liquor dealer or a liquor retailer. Are there any other questions?
There's one that is from Jeff Rocker. He asks, there was language in one version of the bill regarding delivery of qualified container to the back seat of a customer in the parking lot. What if the customer is on foot, bicycle, etc.? So the qualified container carryout, that's delivered directly to the customer on the premises. So what mode of transportation they're utilizing would not matter.
Are there any carryout options available to 210-1 holders? The scope of a 210-1 permit is still for on-premises consumption only, so that did not change this session.
In terms of the Youth Employment Act, the only bit we're going to hit on is just what we did today, which was the impact on restricted employee permits for alcoholic beverage service. So in terms of the remaining components of that bill, that's a DOL issue, and I would encourage you to reach out to DOL.
Looks like there's a
Department of Labor.
question from Tina about liquor liability insurance that she currently holds. Reach out to your agent. I don't want to answer that for you, but there is no exception if you don't intend to have happy hour. The liquor liability insurance requirement will apply to all, regardless of whether you intend to do happy hours or not.
Yep. And that is a common requirement in other states that dram shop insurance be held by retailers.
And on that note, we got another question. There is an exception for permits that are deposited in escrow in a non-operational status. So if your permit is currently in escrow, you will only have to provide that proof of liquor liability insurance when you request to take that permit out of escrow and actually open and are operational.
That's a really good question, Susan. Thank you. I should have included that in my recitation. Great question.
It looks like there are some questions about happy hour and the restrictions. I would say, and jump in here if I'm missing something, the restrictions are you're limited to a certain number of hours a week. Chris, can you remind us how many hours in a week?
Yep, 15 hours a week, 4 hours within a given day, and not between 9 p.m. and 3 a.m.
And obviously all of the prohibitions on sales to intoxicated persons would still apply. So there still has to be responsible service during those times. And you cannot sell to intoxicated persons, whether they're intoxicated when they come in or they become intoxicated while they're there. That prohibition applies to both of those scenarios.
And going along with that, that is one of the reasons why the legislation explicitly prohibits bottomless or unlimited beverages.
And then can you have a happy hour pop-up during special promotions like on St. Patrick's Day? As long as you don't exceed the 4 hours in one day, or you haven't exceeded the hours in a week, and it's not after 9 p.m., they can be pop-up. It doesn't have to be a weekly thing.
Got a question here. Ashley, I think just answered the legality of bottomless. The answer is it's illegal. No bottomless, no unlimited beverages. that does not impact wedding packages, group packages as was indicated. Regarding servers is 18, does a bartender okay have to remove the beer or other from the refrigerator and uncap it? And if the 18-year-old server can carry the beer but cannot be in the bar area, how does that work? So the 18, like I said, the restricted employee permit is the same. All of the requirements, the conditions, the factual arrangements of the restricted employee permit apply. They haven't changed. The only change is that now an 18-year-old is included within that. So however you've been handling 19 and 20-year-olds, assuming it's been legal, that's what applies to the 18-year-old. That may not have answered your question. And honestly, I don't know that we have an answer, but Ashley or Jessica, I don't know if you could answer the part about the removing the beer or other from the refrigerator and uncap it. That's not a
Well,
fact pattern.
I would say
encountered.
restricted employees are obviously only permitted to serve alcoholic beverages in a dining area. So by virtue of that, I would say no, they cannot be in the bar area, removing the beer, uncapping it. Someone else would have to do that, and then they will take it to serve at the table in the dining area.
Perfect.
So Jeff has a question. Will you have to provide evidence of dram shop coverage for the full term of the permit if renewed? I think what this question is getting at is not asking whether it's permissible to apply and then cancel it. I think what it's asking is, what if their insurance year term doesn't line up with their permit term?
Yeah, so the requirement is that you constantly have the coverage. So if those things don't line up, as long as you don't lapse, that's not something I think we can hold against you. But as a general matter, you can't lapse. So ideally, it
And-
would be for the full term. Go ahead, Ashley.
I was just gonna add, like, in addition to providing that proof of liquor liability insurance, one, for the compliance deadlines, but two, going forward for renewals, we can also ask for that at any time upon request. So I think that could cover any sort of mismatch between the permit term and the term of your insurance.
Did you want to go ahead, Jessica?
Oh, I was just gonna say, we just got a new question on, does the 15-hour per week limitation on happy hour or social hour also apply to all-day beverage promotions?
No.
No, the all-day beverage promotions that have been permissible are still permissible and don't count against those hour limitations.
Some really good questions. We appreciate these.
All right, with that, we are at 11 o'clock, which was the end time for our CLE. We will post the link to the CLE form in the chat again. But we can stay on and keep answering questions if there are more questions that people have.
For sure. Yeah, for all the attorneys or anybody who's cutting out, appreciate you joining us. Hopefully this was informative for you. And yes, email's best for questions. That way we can collaborate between the legal team and get you something in detail. So please email if you have additional follow-up questions.
Can you bring your emails back up on the?
Absolutely.
Also just wanted to
Thank you,
jump
Bob.
in here and say thank you for your patience today. This is the first time that we have hosted a live webinar, and we are certainly learning as we go. So thank you all for your patience.
Doesn't look like there's any more questions coming in. Thanks, Abby.
Yeah, thank you all for your time today.
Yep, we appreciate it. Take care, y'all.